Oh no, yes. Where are you? I am here. That's one of the reasons because I don't have I'm not mad. No, I was thinking about this today. We might have to. The next time he says his character is bad experience. He can say that. See what happens. Yeah, so I think part of this, my understanding of this timeline, he got out to service the war was showed up. He didn't have his.
Test. Because that's, I mean, it's there and people could hear, but let's see. Checking microphone. Okay. Yeah, this is my okay. Good evening. How's the volume? More? A little more? Better? Getting there? Up. Keep going. Keep going. Better? Better? We're trying not to have feedback. The sound test was interesting earlier. Are we good? Okay. Hello and welcome. I'm Angela Metler. I am an administrative assistant in the President's Office at South Dakota Mines. Thank you for coming to Steam Cafe tonight. We do this every third Tuesday, and I love seeing a big crowd, so thanks for coming. Also, thank you to anybody who is attending online. We're broadcasting this on Zoom. So at the very end of the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session, live, of course. And anybody who is attending on Zoom, if you have a question, please type your question into either the Q&A box or the chat box, and I will ask it live, and it will be answered live. So without further ado, Dr. Travis Kowalski.
Thank you and good night. Oh my. All right. All right, now that we're all awake, thank you everybody for being here. Like I said, or like Angela said, my name is Travis Kowalski, and we're going to be talking about the burials of Euclid and Anna, which is this weird academic rabbit hole I got dropped into by reading this book called Performing Mathematics. And in the second paragraph of this book, there is this line in there that says something about the Conic Section Rebellions at Yale. And if you're a mathematician and you hear the phrase Conic Section Rebellions, you don't stop to put the book down until it's done. And so I've spent the past year learning a little bit more about this weird bit of American history. So, all right, is there a button that makes this work? It worked earlier. Or I'm going to have to use the mouse. There we go. That'll work. Fantastic. So this is going to be a talk about education in America that's going to involve new technology, controversial curriculums, drag in schools, book burnings, and yet somehow none of these three states. Instead, this is going to be a talk that takes place largely in New England in the 1800s. And it's going to be about this strange American tradition of textbook burials, which was a tradition in which students at the end of one of their years of school, usually their sophomore years, would celebrate their mathematical triumphs by dressing in costumes and burning all of their textbooks. It was a tradition that started in Yale and then kind of expanded through most of New England, eventually getting all the way out to Berkeley by the time we got to the 1870s. In fact, by the 1880s, that was the high point of this trend. There are at least 30 different schools that I have records for where this was just an annual tradition. So what I mean, all of us sort of have an idea of what we sort of think of when we think like book burnings and controversial schools, and maybe less of us have an idea of what a midnight ritualistic book burning might look like outside of maybe some nasty things in the 40s. So I wanted to give you an idea of what these look like. This is what's called the burial of burden. This was the ceremony that was conducted in Berkeley. And it sort of shows the essential pieces. There is a person here who is about ready to give up his textbook. He's giving a eulogy to the textbook, which in these things is always called the corpse. So he's giving a eulogy to the corpse. The corpse is going to be tossed into this bonfire, and then its ashes are going to be interred into this tiny little coffin right here, while there's a group of sophomores, in this case, in the ceremonial robes who are singing songs, and then there's a group of onlookers who are watching the thing. This isn't some weird protest. This isn't some weird counterculture thing. This is just a public event. This is just a thing you did. Every year you'd come and you'd see these things. This is the version that Dartmouth had, and it sort of shows a little bit more of what's going on here, where it's not just the books, it's also a ceremony. You've got people who are dressed in these sort of fantastic clothes. You've got mathematical devils who are running around who would poke you with geometric theorems and things. You've got all of these people who are singing songs that were written for the occasion. And then you've got, again, this big throng of people who are watching. This is just a thing. It was just part of college life. Here is another one from Princeton. This is sort of a close-up of the bonfire here, and also sort of shows some of the other characters who would show up in these things. A lot of times the students would dress up as professionals, as businessmen, as officers, and then there were always some of the students who were dressed up as the virgin mourners. They were always dressed in white. They were always played by the boys in drag. And they're just a constant part of this. They're the most popular part of these ceremonies, were the 3 or 4 virgin mourners who were wailing at the loss of the textbooks. It's weird, right? I mean, how have we not heard of these things before? But these are just a piece of ordinary life. This is actually an honest-to-God photograph. This is taken from Amherst in 1883, and so you can get an idea that it's not just like woodcuts exaggerating things. You can see, here are some of the virgin mourners. Here you can see the priest, the high chief. His name is Cardinal Numbers, who actually leads the oration. There's the undertaker. Here are some of the mathematical devils. This little leather gimpy guy will give you nightmares, so don't stare at him too long. You've got weird clowns in the back who are pallbearers. You've got soldiers. Just this weird motley array of characters, and the tiny coffin that the book's ashes go in. This is just weird, right? I mean, it's such a bizarre thing, but it was just a part of life. Here's a New York Times, 1853, page 8. There's an article on one of these events, the burial of Euclid at Yale. Old Euclid's ghost, though more obliging than Banquo's in the matter of going down when bidden, will not stay down, and each successive class feels a duty to inter him with all due honors. Of late years, the manner of performing these ceremonies has been justly and severely censured as sacrilegious and profane. A scene of midnight frolic with many a grotesque characters assembled there. Ingenuity must have been put to the racks to invent such outlandish disguises. It's just a thing you did. Go over to the West Coast. Here is the San Francisco Call on page 11 from the 1897 printing. Buried burden, which was their ceremony. Within the gaze of a throng of 3,000 people, spectators, the freshmen of the State University celebrated the burial of Burden in Nimtu tonight, marking the most brilliant events of this kind ever held at Berkeley. At 8 o'clock, the procession of freshmen started from North Berkeley, accompanying the coffin, in which was deposited a copy of Minto's Manual in Algebra. They passed through the streets, surrounding a hollow square on a huge truck, wherein the coffin and the speakers were sitting, right? So they're just parading around this little book, this little tiny coffin with the ashes of a book in it. People are speaking, and a continual stream of fireworks is going off, right? This is not a protest. This is not culture war. This is just a thing you did, right? This is less Nuremberg than when we burned the big M before a big football game. This is just a thing you did. In fact, it was so commonplace that people get bored after a while. This is from Maine, the Portland Daily Press. This is from 1878. This is the excerpts from Bowdoin College. They talk about the sophomore prize, the junior examination, and oh yeah, we're gonna set fire to a bunch of textbooks tonight. It's a one-line toss-out in this thing. So put that in your head, right? The weird costumes, the ordinary things, all of the weird stuff, and there's like one question that you're asking, what? What? which actually would have been a much better title for this particular talk right here. And so that's kind of what we're going to spend the rest of our time here trying to figure out, is the what and whys of this tradition. And I'm going to try to do that by answering the whens first. So this is a thing that happens over this 80-year period in America, from roughly 1820 to the 1900s. And that's actually, the Civil War is like sort of right in the middle. And it kind of divides this into two periods. The period of the early burials, and then the period of sort of the grand burials, the Gilded Age. And so the talk is going to be broken into 4 parts. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the burial of Euclid, the first of these, the sort of Platonic ideal of a textbook burial. Then we're going to talk about the early spread of the textbook burials, how this weird idea spread in an age when paper is still not readily available. How does something go viral in an age like that? Then we'll talk about what's known as the Gilded Age of math burials, when they hit their high point. And then we'll talk about their rapid disappearance, how they suddenly went from being a thing everybody was doing in New England to a thing no one remembers anymore over the course of about a decade. So you guys ready? All right, so the burial of Euclid. Our story is going to start with Yale. So Yale is the 3rd college that was founded in the United States in 1701 in New Haven, Connecticut. It was originally a theological school, but it switched over to sciences and the liberal arts around the time of the Revolution. College then is not like how we think of it now, where you have all these different majors. There was one curriculum. All students took the exact same classes in the exact same sequence. And that's because the students at Yale are all the same, right? They are white, they are rich, they are male. They are coming from affluent families. And so the purpose was not to give them critical thinking skills or to train them in specialized knowledge. The curriculum was to give them discipline, to teach them how to be learned men who were capable of leading other men, because that was the station into which they were born. They were learning how to go and command the respect of others. And so the curriculum was built to do that. Now, the guy who's responsible for the curriculum at the start of our story was their 7th president, Jeremiah Day. This guy's like a Dickens character. He was born like sickly and frail and managed to outlive everybody he ever met. He wanted to be a preacher, but he was never, well enough to be able to carry out there, so he got into academics instead. And what he decided was that the United States, we were the heir to the Greek tradition of the liberal arts, that we were the next in line to be the great site for the classic 7 liberal arts. And so he built his curriculum around that. His instructors lectured from classic texts, and then students would, every couple of days, would meet with their tutor, and then they would recite the lessons. So you weren't question and answer, you're like reciting what you had been taught. And if it was a math class, that meant you were reciting proofs. You were going through proofs. That's actually why when you meet with a grad student today, we call it a recitation section, even though none of us are reciting anything from a textbook anymore. Now, discipline comes in 2 flavors. There's physical discipline, making your body strong. And so that's why, PE is a big part of the Yale curriculum, but there's also mental discipline. And Jeremiah Day thought that math was the key to doing that. That mathematical training wasn't useful because math was useful. Mathematical training was useful because it taught you how to think. It taught you how to reason. It taught you how to argue. In fact, he thought that so much that he even wrote his own textbooks because he was tired of learning how to argue in the European way, so he was going to make American ways to argue mathematics. This is actually his textbook, Day's Algebra, which is one of the first in sort of a line of ever-changing editions of textbooks. So for all of the students who are here who are always tired that the textbook changes every 3 years or so, that's the guy. He's also the guy who started that problems in a textbook should be called exercises instead of problems, because again, the analogy of physical exercise. So I'm about to show you what only the richest white people in America got to see, the curriculum of Yale. So if you were a student who was going to Yale, this is what Yale looked like in 1820. You could get a Yale education by going down to the library and spending an afternoon there. There's a bunch of things in here. All I really want to point out is where the math is, right? Jeremiah Day thought math is important. And so I'm going to highlight where math occurs in this curriculum. And it happens really early and really heavy. At the end of your sophomore year, you don't have to do it anymore, but your sophomore year is a math year. You are doing trigonometry, you are doing logarithms, you are doing plane and spherical trigonometry, you are doing conic sections, and you're doing this in sort of this classic Greek style. And that's hard work. I'm going to quote a guy named Clarence Deming, He said that the sophomore mathematics was the bugbear of the Yale curriculum. Freshmen looked forward to them with dread, and juniors looked back on them with a joking sense of release, and sophomores were aggressive in demanding any easement which could be derived by precedent. This led to a troubling period when the sophomore instructors differed widely in their exaction of classroom work, and it came to a head in 1825. And this is from a small paper that are called The Yale Wars of the Conic Sections. Right, this is the thing that is like, I have to know more about this. So I'm going to lead you up to the Yale Wars and give you what the first shot is. The Archduke Ferdinand of the Yale Wars, if you'd like. And it was new technology. A piece of technology so insidious that it got the students of Yale up in arms. This. The blackboard, exactly. The blackboard. Now, I don't want to give you the impression like the blackboard was somehow invented at Yale. Slates had been used for forever. At the start of the 1800s, paper is not cheap, and pencils are non-existent, right? These are not things that a person can have. But kids would grow up with a tiny slate, something about the size of a laptop now, and you could use that and mark on it over and over again. When you went to college, you still carried your slates with you. This was the tool that you wrote with, which sort of necessitated working one-on-one with your instructors. So if you are a Yale student and you are taking a math class, when you're in recitation, you might use this to write down some notes here, but you weren't using these little things to draw the pictures, because they're just tiny, and the pictures look like this, right? So it was tradition prior to 1820 to go in recitations and to recite the proofs, but you were allowed to refer to the pictures in the books, what were called the plates. 1820, though, the first blackboards are introduced in the United States. They're introduced at West Point, and they were just a wall painted black on which you could mark with chalk. But suddenly, that meant that instruction wasn't one-on-one with a student. It meant that instruction is now a performance, right? You go up to the front of a classroom, you perform in front of everybody, you do your work in front of an entire set of other eyes. At Yale, that meant you had to start drawing those elaborate pictures. And Yale was not prepared for the response to that, which was not good. This is what's known as the Conic Section Rebellion, or in fact, 2 of them, actually. And so I'm going to go and let that Clarence Deming actually tell the story a little bit, because I like his version. In 1825, the sophomore tutor of the class of 1827 in Conic Sections asserted that the class would demonstrate from the picture, draw at the board, instead of explain from the book. Thereupon, 38 members of the sophomore class of 88 men formed a combine and refused to recite Conic Sections at all. Right, so the rule was you had to drop on the board. 38 of the students in the class said no, and just refused to do anything in recitations. And so Yale suspended them, kicked them out for 3 days. And then something happened that never happens anymore. All of the parents said, you know what, you should probably listen to your teachers, and sent the students back to sign a concession form. Yes, we were bad students, we apologize, we'll never do it again. And so the students were admitted, and life continued on. They drew at the blackboard. Oops. There we go. The real question at issue was never resolved, and that was whether or not the class should be forced to draw the diagrams on the blackboard or not. Now, the Conic Section Rebellion of 1825 was to the Conic Section mutiny 5 years later as a skirmish to a campaign. Indeed, as measured by its immediate asperity and by its results, the rebellion of 1830 is to be ranked as by far the most grave in Yale history. So what happened 5 years later? Well, 5 years before, the class of 1832 formed a combination and pledged themselves not to recite from separate figures. So the tutor has his box where he pulls the people out. He has his deadly box. He draws 9 names out. 9 men refuse to recite. So the tutor declares the recitation closed. He says that he's detected clear evidence of a combination, which had been forbidden since 1825, and he reserved the 9 for special punishment. They were expelled from the college, not suspended. They were just straight up kicked out of Yale. Now, what ends up happening is, oops, I want to do this one right here. The drastic action of the faculty split the class of 95 sophomores into 2 groups. About half of them submit. They say, we're sorry, and they go back to class, they recite. But 44, including the 9 who were expelled, they resolve to hang together. They do not give in. And so what happens is there's a week of back and forth between the 44 and first the teachers and then the administration. And at the end of a week of back and forth, all 44 of them are summarily expelled. They were not messing around. Among the people who were expelled and actually blackballed because the president of Yale wrote to other colleges to say don't be admitted, one of them was Andrew Calhoun, who was the son of the then acting vice president of the United States. Another one was Alfred Stille, who would go on to become one of America's most famous physicians. He was the first secretary of the American Medical Association, and I think the 22nd president of it. But Yale was not messing around with this. To go back to Clarence Deming, the mathematical ghost of those mutinies stalked constantly in song and legend through the undergraduate life of that old time. It was on the mathematical rock of the biennial and later annual exams that many an undergraduate bark shivered. It was the mathematical paper that was ever the objective of conspiracy, fraud, and bribery to secure. And the burial of the textbook was but an expression of the conventional undergraduate attitude towards mathematics in general, with poor Euclid as its personal emblem. And there is the mention of the burial of the textbook. See, what happens after 1830, there are no more rebellions, there are no more riots. Yale is not going to mess around, so the students go underground. These are the sons and grandsons of revolutionary warriors. These are the sons and grandsons of Freemasons. These are kids who grew up with their dads in secret societies. And so they start making their own secret societies, but the most famous of which is Skull and Bones, Order 322, which was founded in 1832 at Yale. All of the Yale's most famous secret societies are founded in the 5-year period after the Second Conic Section Rebellion. And a number of secret ceremonies start to pop up as a way of sort of protesting without having to protest. The most famous of these is going to be the burial of Euclid. So this is organized in secret by the sophomores to commemorate whenever they would successfully navigate that second year, right? You get done with the second year, you've done math. You don't have to do any more math anymore. And so this ceremony is designed to be, in equal measure, a celebration of this. They survived what the class of 1830 did not, or class of 1832 did not. But it was also sort of a chance to thumb their nose at the traditions of the old Yale men, to make sort of a mockery of the kinds of people who were holding them back. And so this ceremony has 3 major acts to it. The very, very first act is what's known as the viewing. And so in the viewing, mourners would assemble in solemn garb, those cloaks, at the temple. And the temple was just a place that changed. Early on, it was actually the chapel at Yale. Eventually, it was like a nook in the woods. In the 1880s, it was actually the Masonic temple. They would go where the Freemasons went. And they would demonstrate their mastery of geometry by having the textbook, the corpse, and they would go through a common recitation. So they would take their textbook and they would do this. I have gone over geometry. I have understood geometry. And then they would take a torch. Oh, there we go. And they would burn a hole. I'm not going to burn this, you monsters. Sorry, baby. They would burn a hole through the textbook, and I've seen it through. And then after all of the students did this with their books, it would just sort of turn into kind of a back and forth where they would tell jokes. They would tell stories from their classrooms. They would have mathematical jokes that they had invented. I have no idea what an 18th century math joke is. I only know what like 21st century math jokes are. Why do mathematicians wear glasses? Maya? To help with division. Right, I mean, thank you very much. So, thank you. Lap it up, Maya. So after the viewing, then around midnight, we'd go to the next phase, the processional. And so the corpse, all the little holes burned in all these books, they would be loaded, they would be carried by pallbearers in a single file line through the woods of New Haven at midnight under the full moon to some predetermined location. At this predetermined location, that's where it was going to end. While they were going through, it was accompanied by torches and pipes and flutes, and people would sing songs. They would sing these dirges. They would take essentially all of the hymns, the sad hymns that they learned in church, and they would tweak the words around a little bit to make them sort of puns about Euclid. Or they would take like traditional singing songs, traditional university like meal songs, and they would turn them into Euclid. One of the most popular is a song called Gaudeamus Igitur. These are the lyrics. I've actually, on your table, there is a set of hymnals. This is actually a really famous piece of music. European schools use it all of the time. I have no idea how to sing this thing, although it's sort of a classic. Dr. Skippers, is this one of the things that you guys do with the choir folks?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I have a melody, yeah.
Want to give it a shot?
Sure, yeah.
All right. Gotta read your notes. Everybody, Garrett Skippers. Now, if your Latin is a little rusty, this translates, there we go. With tearful eyes, we mind Euclid no more. Let us all sing now with sorrow, for though we indulge in grief, this ends in joy. Because the next phase after the processional was the cremation, where they would take the book in, they would take the corpse in, there would be a sermon that was conducted in Greek or Latin, and then the book is burned, or all of the books are put together, they are burned, and then they are put into an urn or one of those little tiny coffins, and then everybody would sing songs. Yale has a whole collection of class songs, and so the students would sing these songs. They would write poems, they would make recitations. This is where prepared speeches were done. Here's a poem from the time. Aloft the smoke clouds swirl and spiral volumes roll, with radius vector infinite outstretching from the pole. In vain he'll flounder and roar, whirled from the Stygian shore, for to his curves our course shall be asymptotic evermore. Now, what's interesting is over time, this starts to morph into groups of characters. It's not just guys in robes and the people who do the burning bit. There starts to be a collection of recurring characters played by the boys. Now, there's always the geometric demons, right? The good angels and the bad angels. There's going to be a lot of math puns. Get used to it. And so you can see, this is sort of a famous lithograph called The Burial of Yale, and you can see some of the demons here. Some of them are playing music right here. Some of them are carrying poor Euclid away up to Zeus over there. There's the pallbearers, right? The ones who carry the book, carry the corpse. They're always dressed as knights, and so they had various names that were all puns. The most common was circumference. There was also surveying and surface. You would have lampooned versions of the Yale men, the kinds of professions that they were being trained for, they would make fun of. And so professions like military officers, so there's like Major Axis and Squire Root in this particular wood print. They would make fun of teachers. The most common was Professor Pilot of Asses, which is a reference to Euclid, and then the tutor Marcus Lowe. They would make fun of the clergy. So very often the person who gave the ceremony was Cardinal Numbers, and the person who burned the priest was Parlero Hypids, the drunk Irishman. They would make fun of bankers, and unfortunately this is pre-Civil War America, so that's racist as hell, and I'm not going to do any of those. And then the things that ends up being the most popular are the virgin wailers. So there's this collection of female family of Euclid, his wife, parenthesis, his sister, antecedent, and then his daughters. And they're always dressed in white, and they're always played by the boys in drag. And I want to point out, this, again, when we sort of think of drag, it's kind of now connected with sort of sexual politics and this part of the sexual revolution. But this is 1820. This is just vaudeville tradition. You want to go and see Shakespeare, it's guys in drag. This is just an acting tradition, a well-respected acting tradition at this point. And so this was a thing that people tried to line up to, because if you could be, if you could pass as one of the most attractive daughters of Euclid, there are references that that was like a prize that you could win in some of these. And so the daughters of Euclid are most often, analytics is the first one, corollary and polygon. There's also polynomial and generation. There's a whole slew of these over time. Right, so you've got this big collection of these. And so, I mean, just kind of imagine it here. You're out, it's midnight. You're out in some field in the middle of New Haven, Connecticut. The textbooks are burning, the smoke is going up, the moon is shining, and you've got all of these students who are together singing songs that are written specifically for this event. Every year, the sophomore class would write a new song that was always based off of some popular piece of music, either a classic hymn, something like O Susanna, or something like Auld Lang Syne. Garrett Skippers and Bryce Tellman, everybody. Right. Are you getting the impression these are elaborate things here? This isn't some backwoods bonfire. These take time and preparation to the point that they had to go and prepare whole programs for these things so that people knew what the songs were. And think of the effort that's going into this, right? You're not banging this out on your computer and then printing out copies. This has to be put together with movable type. This has to be designed, printed, distributed in secret, because if Yale ever found out, you would be expelled for it. This is crazy. This is also why you have all those characters. Why do you need a bunch of students whose names can't be determined? Well, if anyone ever finds out, all right, the funeral dirge was done by you-know-who, damn it, I don't know who to go and kick out of school. Right? This is one of the reasons why this happens. So, I just actually want to give you a picture of what one of these things looks like, too. Just another one, a picture right here. And now at least you can start to have some context, right? Here are the daughters of Euclid. There's analytics right there. There's polygon right here. You can see the priest. There's cardinal numbers and parallelopipes. You can see the teachers back here. You can tell they're teachers because they're wearing togas over their suits. And there's one of the sophomores who's just like, I beat, right? He's just like, living large. And there's the coffin, this little brass coffin that they would stick the ashes into. Funny thing about this picture, though, is this is not Yale. No Yale ceremony was ever photographed. This is from Gallaudet, one of America's first deaf universities. And think about how weird that has to be, right? The burials are not sanctioned by Yale. If you were found to have been involved in it, you would be expelled. The ceremonies themselves are never publicly advertised. They're distributed amongst the sophomores. The funeral programs are only given out to the sophomores, and that discreetly. Right? This is a ephemeral Yale experience that was rooted in this thing of Yale history, the Conic Section Rebellions. There's no reason this should go viral. But in an age when that doesn't even make sense, right? No one believes in germs yet. How does something go viral? And so that's going to be the next bit here. So this is 1840. The burials of Euclid have been going on for about a decade. They sort of hit this pattern, this established program that we've seen. Over the next 20 years or so, this is going to grow to 10 different colleges in New England. And it's not just them doing textbook burials, it's them doing the burial of Euclid with slight changes. Now, the two people who are most responsible for this are these two guys right here. Ezekiel Porter Belden, there's no portrait of him, so I just took someone from Yale and blackbarred him out. And then William Nathaniel Taylor Root. So Zeke over here, he's a Yale man. He was the son of a Yale man who was the son of a Yale man. His son was a Yale man. If he could have married a Yale man, he would, but he did the next best thing, which was the daughter of a Yale man. He lived and breathed Yale. He loved this school. And so as he was nearing the end of his life, he started to go and put his recollections together. He talked about what his recollections were. He talked to his son, what his sons were doing, what his son's friends were doing, and he put them together into a book called The Sketches of Yale College. And then he published it after his death because he didn't even want to be accidentally involved in embarrassing the school. It was published anonymously and posthumously. William Root, on the other hand, he's not a Yale man, but he was a teacher at Yale. He was a firm believer in discipline. He wrote a number of teaching textbooks. One of his catchphrase was, "Every teacher is his own drill instructor," which gives you some idea of what his classes were like. He did an awful lot of work with physical exercise. He worked a lot with their version of ROTC. He would do drills with them. And so he learned all of the songs that the students sang. And so he, along with a colleague, again, anonymously published the songs of Yale, the first edition of which came out in 1852, and then they would bring out a new edition every year. And these two books were huge. They were wildly popular. Yale was regarded as the American school. It was known to have all of these traditions, but they were hidden behind a wall of inscrutability. And now all of a sudden, students had a window into it. They could see the traditions of Yale. They could learn the songs of Yale. And so college students started to take these and adopt them and adapt them to themselves. And here's why this is relevant to us. Inside Sketches of Yale, there is a 4-page spread on the burial of Euclid. What it is, and the fact that it went back to time immemorial. It went back to 1932, but all right, this is a guy who's trying to sell up Yale every breath of his body. It goes through how the viewing works. It goes through how the midnight processional works. It goes through what's supposed to happen during the cremation, and it even talks about the kinds of songs you're supposed to sing as you disband off into the woods. Songs of Yale, actually dead center of the book, has a spread on the burial songs. The odes that you would sing during the processional, and then each one of the sophomores' special songs, added to this over and over and over again. So these two things give people this great insight into what's going on. As students start to adapt it too, this sort of opens up a whole new market in books, college books, where publishers would tell the traditions and the songs of colleges. And so students would do something, they would adopt it, it would show up in the next edition, somebody else would adopt it, and you've got this feedback loop of these ideas percolating through New England relatively quickly. And I just want to give you an idea of the pace of this and what happens here. So here's Yale, 1840. There's the basic outline of the burial of Euclid. Within 1 year of the publication of Sketches of Yale, Yale's crosstown rival, Trinity College, they're about 40 minutes away, another liberal arts school, hated each other. They were always trying to one-up each other. A year after the first edition of Sketches of Yale comes out, Trinity goes and comes up with their own ceremony. They would say, while Yale looks back, we look forward, and they came up with the Concrematio Conicorum, the cremation of conics. They're a brand new thing entirely. It was organized in secret by the sophomore class. Mourners proved their mastery of geometry by desecrating the textbook. There's a torchlight processional. The eulogy is given in Latin only, completely different. You burn the book, but you don't put it in a coffin. You send it to sea on a flaming boat. But otherwise, you have all the other same characters, right? This is the burial of Euclid with a couple of changes added to it. And this happens over and over again. The next school who has a recorded one is 140 miles north. This is Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts. Another liberal arts school. They go and adopt the same thing, but they call theirs the burial of mathematics. And again, they make tweaks that are useful to them. During their morning ceremony, the viewing, they actually build an effigy of Euclid. And so during the little burning part where they punch a hole in, they actually punch a big triangular hole through Euclid and they stick their head through the effigy as part of the I've seen through Euclid part. They also start adding more and more elaborate costumes to their characters. They sort of become famous for adding a lot of distinctive flair to what their costumes are going to look like. Then these go into these stories, and then they start percolating over. So the idea of having elaborate costumes just becomes part of how you do these things. If we were to go up to upstate New York, here is Hamilton College. Hamilton College was a liberal arts school that focused on the burgeoning industries of science. They were trying to get leaders who were going to be ahead of an industrial revolution. And so all of their students took calculus instead of geometry. And so they had something called the burial of calculus, where they would bury calculus. They didn't have Euclid anymore, so it was just old man calculus now is what they would bury. And they expanded their cast of characters. They added a group of clown pallbearers, cycloid, hyperbola, and abscissa. The math people will get those ones. They also added roles for the virgin mourners. Now, the boys in the audience were supposed to woo the virgin mourners and to see whether or not they could woo them with their mathematical pickup lines. Again, no idea what an 18th century mathematical pickup line is. Are you 90 degrees? Because you look all right. You've got more curves than a triple integral. I have no idea what these things are, and I have no references for them anywhere. Let's go over to Maine. In Maine, there's Bowdoin College. Bowdoin College is sort of the fifth school that I know historically who introduces these. Another liberal arts school, and they know about this. They actually send students to one of Yale's and they get one of their programs. It's actually on display in their library. And so they build one that's a perfect homage to Yale's, but uses a lot of the traditions that Hamilton put together. So they call it the Burial of Analytics. It's run by the junior class because that's when you took calculus at Bowdoin. And so it looks the same as the Hamilton version, except they added a thing. Now they always had some part for the current professor of mathematics, because this is still when there is one professor for mathematics, which is the thing that would be carried forward for a lot of the later burials. At the time in Bowdoin, this would have been the dreaded William Smith. People were terrified of this man. He was famous because no one could ever please him. He was always invited to show up to these things, but if you get the chance to hear some of the songs they wrote about him, you'll understand why they never did. Poetic, wasn't it? Thank you to our burial quartet. So these ceremonies, they get recorded, they get translated back and forth, times grow. These college books give the idea that these ceremonies are just an integral part of being in college. The thing is that every school has these their own little things. Yale has a wooden spoon ceremony. Trinity had their own things. But everybody who's in college right now, they take math, and everybody hates it. So it's the one thing that every college student can do. It is the one tradition that every college student can participate in. And so that's one of the reasons why this version of this ceremony becomes popular through New England. It's a through line that is shared by all American students with one glaring asterisk. Women and black men not included. And that's gonna change. And it's gonna take a lot of blood to get it done. So during the Civil War, there are no textbook burials. Students, a lot of colleges aren't even running. Students are being sent to war. Their brothers are being sent to war. Their fathers are being sent to war. But after the war ends, the textbook burials come back in a big way. They become even more popular. At their high points in the 1880s, there are more than 30 of these, and they span the east to the west coast. But they're different after the war, right? Everybody who is going to college, they've just witnessed death on a profound scale. They've either been to war, their brothers or fathers have been to war. They know people who've died. At the same time, society's changing, right? Chattel slavery has been outlawed. The Transcontinental Railroad is making the country very, very small. A small group of people own most of the wealth. There are labor disputes in the streets. People are worried about immigration. Everything old is new again, apparently. Right? The world was just different. And so these common ceremonies end up becoming a way that students can try to work their way through these changes. Previous burials were sort of secret ceremonies about math as an eternal abstract concept, But the burials that happen after the Civil War, they're extravagant, and they personify math as immortal, and they focus very much on death. Students are trying to work their way through these changes. And so I'm going to go back to Bowdoin College, the place with William Smith who screwed us hard in that song. I've got two images from here. This is a pre-Civil War flyer and a post-Civil War flyer. And I just want to compare, not the flyers, I don't know how to read the Greek or the Latin that's on them, but the ceremonies. In 1853, it's called the burial of mathematics. Calculus is a concept. It is the object of the cremation, and it's interpreted as ghostly and eternal, and you have to put it down every year. Analytics is just one of the virgin mourners. She's one of the ladies in white. She's just a side character, and this is a secret ceremony. But by the time you get to 1876, this is now called the burial of analytics. Calculus is now personified as a person. It's now personified as analytics, and she is a living, breathing person. She is this antagonistic old Union lady, right? She is this person who gives all of the sophomores a hard time, but we know deep down she's trying to do what's right for them. Defeating calculus is sort of interpreted as resulting in Anna's death in the here and now. They survive calculus at the expense of Anna. And so this ceremony is kind of about her dying. To the point where they go and they publicly put a headstone on the campus every year to commemorate Anna's death. Right, the very first one, according to legend, said, "Anna, finally at rest." All the math people again, this is a good math joke. For humanities people, take a calculus class, it's a fantastic joke. But they would put her in the ground, and then they would send her off with sort of funeral military honors. Guys? Burial quartet, everybody. I'm not making this up too. These still exist on the Bowdoin campus. There are 4 of them still in what's known as the Whispering Pines area of the campus, the 4 Anna stones. So some of the schools really lean into this whole macabre death thing. This is Dartmouth, who has been doing these ceremonies since at least 1850, but after the Civil War, they go full into like the morbid. All of their things have skulls. They start making the flyers look like little tiny coffins. And again, they're picking people, right? They're making avatars. In this case, they burned mathematics all of the time. They had this avatar who was the focus of their ire, and their completion of calculus results in mathematics death over and over and over again. There's actually a recovered book from one of the book burnings too. Syracuse University is an Ivy League school. They were focused on science and technology moving forward. They had a big focus on calculus. They only had post-Civil War burial ceremonies, and so they just leaned hard into the Gilded Age. They had 2 people who were their avatars. There was John R. Calculus and his wife Analytics. And so every one of these things is, again, you survive, this couple die. They had all, and unlike Analytics from Bowdoin College, who was at least sort of a beloved antagonist, they hate these people, right? These are just pure antagonists. John R. Man, he was a man of horrid fame. Of horrid fame was he. To torture softs and scare the fresh was John R.'s perfect Lee. Guy was a dick. When they would talk about Anna, there's a tonal difference here that's going to get a little creepy. Her enchanting form, her bewitching glance, her seductive wiles, her siren voice proved powerless against the bold, bad sophomores. And as in turn they appeared before her, it was only to prove their might and inflict chastisement on the audacity that she married. Right? This is a time when women are starting to get more rights. And these ceremonies, which are white men, are starting to react more and more to that one. You start to see a little bit more of a reactionary trend in some of these later burials. One of the things that these guys do too is no one does a bigger show than these ones. When they do the viewing, they would rent out the Syracuse Depository, And they would have, at the depot, and they would have the entire town come. And they'd actually have like John R. and Anna, and they'd just be like up at the top, like they would have two kids who just sat there and were the dead people for the entire viewing. They didn't do a midnight processional, they did a boat cruise. They would get on the Glen Haven ferry, and they would go across Lake Skaneateles, where they would have the cremation service at the Skaneateles Hotel. They would dance all night, and then they would do the book burning on the shores of Lake Skaneateles under fireworks. Right? These guys did full stop. My favorite of this group, though, is Amherst College, because they've documented it so well. They've documented about 21 years of these. They're a liberal arts school from Amherst, Massachusetts. They were essentially founded in an attempt to relocate Williams College, which was the third of the schools we talked about. And their burials are ornate and extravagant. This is the very, very first one they did in 1866, the burial rites of classic mathematics. They would take pictures of these things. So this is that picture at the very beginning. And now at least you know who some of these people are. There's Anna, analytics. There are some of her sisters, Polygon, and that's generation. There's cardinal numbers. Here are some of the mathematical demons. Here is cycloid, abscissa, and hyperbola. That guy right there, there's surveying. Right, now we know who these people are. These are the characters and what their roles are in here. Look at the work they put into their flyers. I mean, these are just gorgeous pieces of visual art. And it took a lot of effort to make these things. Eventually, they start making avatars too. So they would sort of rotate through their avatars. Mathematics in 1882, algebra in 1883. As they go on, there's a trend to have their avatars be women. Women are these avatars. They're presented as temptresses and tormentors, and in a break from the other schools, they're alive at the start of the ceremony. They are tried and found guilty and sentenced to death. This is a little twist on that version. They get a little darker over at Amherst. This is one of the last ones. This is 1888. The last one was 1886. Sorry, this is 1886. The last one was 1888. Here's another group here. There's analytics. Right there. She's called the Witch of Agnesy this particular year. Again, math pun for the math folks out here. She's always presented as a temptress of the devil. What's interesting about this picture, though, is Annie in this picture. I'm going to zoom in on her. If any of you know your musical history, this is Clyde Fitch. He was America's #1 playwright in the 1900s to 1920s. Got his start in drag as Annie Lytics in some of the textbook burials. I do want to point out, right, Annie's always alive at this. They don't like burn the student they're always burning a textbook. It's a textbook burial, except once. The very last one they ever did, they make an effigy. They actually make an Annie Lytics and they burn her. Is the last one that they do. And so I'm sorry, that got a little dark. So I'm going to do a palate cleanser right here and talk about Vassar College. Because, oh my God, these ladies. So Vassar College is a liberal arts school founded in 1861. It's America's second women's college. And so to many, men would derisively call it Vassar Female College. It wasn't a real college. And so women had to work twice as hard just to show that they were half as competent. And so they would do all of the things that college students did. They would hold public biennial exams where they would show what they had learned in public ceremonies. They had a whole number of competitive sports teams, including baseball, which was the purview of men. And they would do all of these things just to prove that they were as good as men. And thankfully, all of that ended in the 60s when we solved racism and feminism all at the same time. They also did the math cremations, but oh my, these ladies. Rather than just go and burn Annie year after year after year, they went and would produce entire full productions. They called them the trig ceremonies because trig was their required math class. And so every year they would pick a different style or a theme and they would make an entire elaborate production. It might be a stage play, it might be a musical, but they would go and create an entire thing and then perform it for the entire campus as a public ceremony. This is the morality play of the 19th century. One of my favorite things is, in a great twist of the tradition, you have the girls in drag. All of your male characters are now played by Vassar women with their mustaches and whatnot. And they were sort of a parody of these other traditions, right? There's always a bad guy who's some parody of trigonometry. There's always the female who needs to be saved. And then there's always the male protagonist played by one of the Vassar girls who does the saving. The most famous of these is something called the Mathematicado, a play on Gilbert and Sullivan's Mikado. It was extremely popular at the time, and the play itself garnered enough attention that it kept popping up in periodicals. It's one of the things that students were like, oh, this is a thing that we could kind of go and do. And it did add, some schools started to add productions to their burial ceremonies near the end run as a result of this. And what's nice about the Mikado, the Mathematicado, is that large portions of this still exist. A full production of it was actually done in Cambridge in the early 2000s. In the Mathematicado, it's the story of young 88. All of the protagonists are always named for the year of the sophomores. And so young 88 falls in love with Trig, but 88 is the favorite one of the Mathematicado. And so it's a love triangle story. One of the famous songs from that one is something called We 389s, which was a reference to the freshman class. Ladies? Haley Armstrong and Hannah Tillman, everybody. The very last one that they ever did was something called The Last Days of the Salem Witchcraft, in which goody trigonometry consorts with sin, and cos and tangent and secant and cotangent, verse sin and coverse sin, and gets burned at the stake for it. This is actually the last one that they ever did. And it wasn't just Vassar. Within 5 years, these are almost entirely gone. This entire tradition just vanishes in a puff of smoke. And so, why? Well, the story began with changes in mathematical education. It's also going to end with these things. And I can sum it up in 2 pictures. This picture right here is the Yale School of Engineering class of 1916. At the start of the 1900s, schools are no longer a one-size-fits-all institution. As technology is expanding, as science is growing, people need specialized knowledge, which means people are taking different tracks. There are electives now. Everyone is not taking the same set of courses in the same years. This picture over here are college entrance exams. By the time you get to the 1900s, another technological innovation has happened. Paper and pencils are dirt cheap. You don't have to go and demonstrate your mathematics at a blackboard in front. Now you can write it down on papers. The age of standardized testing begins. For better or for worse, this happens at the beginning of 1900s. And so Americans aren't having the same college experience anymore, right? They're not taking the same math classes in the same years. They're not required to recite and perform in front of people. And so math and a dislike for it is not the common shared experience, which means cremation ceremonies aren't the common experience anymore. Let's add, oh, this is a great thing. This is from Bowdoin. This is the year that math became electives at Bowdoin. The classical sophomores are wildly running around and begging their friends to congratulate them. Mathematics is now an optional study with them, and analytics has no more terrors. Truly, the world improves. I don't know if I agree with that last part, but in addition to curricular changes, there's societal changes. Here are 2 pictures from Columbia's Burial of the Ancient. That was their ceremony. Here is a pre-Civil War one, where they would dress up in like tricorner hats even, and they would conduct themselves through this elaborate ritual. Here's a picture from 1882. There's a person being burned at the stake on it. There are people who are locked up behind there, right? They got darker, they got meaner, they got ruder. People got drunker at them. They became less ceremonies and more slugfests. And so college administrators started to get tired of them. This is from Union College, and I love this one. To an upper-class man, the cremation of algebra as carried out this year seems a deplorable custom. For college men to engage in a slugging match, urged on by the worst element the city affords, seems deplorable indeed. And these are just pretty common by the time you get to the 1890s. At their worst, college administrators are saying, this is just bringing out the worst characteristics. You're not getting disciplined young men, you're getting hooligans. But even at their best, when it was the classic versions, these are still wealthy white male traditions. And the post-Civil War versions are just bringing a lot of the elitist and the misogynist elements to the top. Even when they're good, they're not great anymore. The death knell for this happens at Bates College. So Bates College is in Maine. It was part of Massachusetts at the time, now it's in Maine. They are a liberal arts school. They were the first co-ed institution in New England. They were also the first institution to grant a woman an undergraduate degree. After the Civil War, they were the nation's leader in accepting black students. They also did the ceremony, right? This is a thing that you would go and do. This is the 1881 burial of analytics. And so this is a co-ed school, as progressive as you can be for 1900s America. But this tradition is still exclusively for white men. Women are allowed to be in the audience. They're not allowed to be any of like the virgin mourners. It's still, all of the characters are played by men, and black men are just excluded from participating. Just straight up not allowed to be in here. The president at the time was a guy named Orrin Cheney. He can't tolerate this, right? He believes firmly in the ideals of a co-ed, multiracial liberal arts education, and he can't stand the hypocrisy of the Bates motto and these ceremonies. And so in 1890, he enforces something called Anna's Law, which explicitly forbids math textbook burials on the Bates campus. It sets the template for other liberal arts schools, and so over the 1890s, most liberal arts schools have a version of Anna's Law. So you put these two things together. The tradition is explicitly outlawed at liberal schools, and it's becoming increasingly irrelevant at technical schools. And so by the time you get to the 1900s, it just goes away. It just vanishes on its own. Anything you can learn from this? I mean, I'm presenting it just I did think it's cool, but maybe we'll give you 2 takeaways with the last of the time I've got. Takeaway number 1 is that math instruction in the United States has always been contentious. Right, we're always sort of, the kids these days, no, kids these days have always been this way. This is what we as Americans do. Our country is founded on being mad and revolting. Kids have always done this thing, and for better or for worse, it's helped guide how we do these. Whether it's geometry versus calculus, whether it's technology, how do we use ChatGPT in a classroom, or do we go back to a slide rule? Critical race theory, do we allow that in a math classroom? By the way, it's not in a math classroom, so let that one go. But these are questions that never, ever end. So when you're sort of worrying about, it seems like the world is falling apart on us and everyone's mad. I don't know about the first part, but we've always been mad. So what we want to do is maybe use that usefully. What it means is student activism has always been a part of this. We need to make sure as educators that we're always bringing the students into these discussions. When we're talking about changes to curriculum, when we're talking about changes to technology, we really need to have the students involved in there. It doesn't necessarily mean we listen or that we take what they say, but they need to be a part of the conversation. We need to know what they're thinking of because that should guide what we do. The other takeaway that I want to get out of this one is that I was an art major before I was a mathematician. I am a mathematician because it is, to me, a humanities. It is a part of the human experience. Math has always been about being human and being humanist. It is the one language that our species agrees on. We don't agree on culture, we don't agree on literature, we don't agree on music, but we agree on how we quantify the world and how that quantification comes together. But we've lost that in the United States a little bit, right? We sort of focus on, we take math not because it is essential to the human experience, but because it's useful. In that book that I showed you, Andrew Fisk, who's sort of the world expert on these traditions, I've read most of his papers to give you this talk, he argues that the uniquely American form of math anxiety can be traced back to this tradition of being performative at the front of a stage, where math became all eyes on you, don't screw up your lines, don't screw up your pictures, make sure you're standing in the right spot, no feedback from the mics, right? It was this performative thing, but it was all the worst parts of performance. It wasn't collaborative, it wasn't a joyous thing, it was a thing you were being graded on. Math cremations, he argues, were a way to tie that math experience back to the other humanities that the liberal arts were supposed to tie together. They were a way of bringing community and theatrics and art into these things. And so I guess the takeaway that I have from that one is that we need to always be working to bring back those things. I know at our school, it's a very STEM-centered school, but that doesn't mean we can't go and bring the humanities into these courses. I have a whole table over there, I think, who will agree with me on that particular part, right? That's why I'm so grateful that you guys are here at these STEAM cafes where we're trying to tie those two things together. So I guess what I want to do here is just to give you an idea of what that would look like. How do you go and tie together your math and arts? Let's go back to the songbook. The very last one we're going to do is we're actually going to sing it all together right here. We're going to go and participate as as we would here, the very last song, it's sung to the tune of "O Susanna." And so I'm going to let the burial quartet start us off here. Special thanks to our burial quartet, Garrett Skippers, Haley Armstrong, Hannah Tellman, and Bryce Tellman. And thank you, everybody. I didn't have any more panels up there anyway. Thank you. All right, I don't know where Angela is. Do we have questions? You said live questions and live answers. Sorry? Who's a what now? All right. Questions from the peanut gallery. Peter.
You think Tom Lehrer in this tradition?
I would love to bring some of the Tom Lehrer songs into here. So Tom Lehrer, if you don't know, he was a great mathematician, but he also wrote fantastic parody songs. Lobachevsky is one that people know fairly well. Peter, do you want to sing any of Lobachevsky?
One man deserves a credit, one man deserves a blame, and Nikolai Lobachevsky is his name.
Hey, there very much. Peter was not prepared to be thrown under the bus this time round. He actually, one of the things that he did, so he was a professor too, and he would sometimes interrupt his classes with songs. One of them is a song called Any Questions. Are there any questions, any problems, any questions? If there are none, then I am done, and I can bid you all farewell. And he would sing the song on the last day of class, and he had people planted in the audience, sort of the way I have my table planted there, who would sing back. Ha! He asked if I have questions. Holy smokes, I've got questions. I've got a ton, and everyone would take him half a day to do. And it would get this big giant round. So yeah, Tom Lehrer is a fantastic example of this one. I have no idea whether or not he is following directly in the burial of Euclid tradition, but he's certainly following in the tradition of making good puns and making mathematics in a way that's sort of fun, and people can be like, I remember those words. I have a rough idea of what these things are. I don't know if that answered your question or not. I guess the short version is I don't know if he knows the burial of math tradition. But for the rest of you, if you don't know who Tom Lehrer is, T-O-M-L-E-H-E-H-R?
H-R-E-R.
Yeah, go find him. He's fantastic. Other questions? Yeah.
These students who graduated from Yale participated in all the ceremonies, shaping and influenced the curriculum and began teaching it.
That is a really good question. And unfortunately, I am not really a historian on math education. What I do know is, at least for the early parts, the math burials themselves just become kind of an irritation to Euclid. There are notes in Euclid papers where the administration would say, we will never have them again, and then the very next year they would say, we will never have them again. So in terms of of the ceremonies themselves, Yale just kind of gets like, yeah, it's a thing that happens right here. In terms of how it changed the curriculum, in the early stages, the things that the Conic Section Rebellions were about didn't do squat for those. At that point, everyone was like, no, you are going to be disciplined men. This is how we're going to go and discipline you. By the time you get to around the 1870s, though, a lot of these students are coming back and sort of saying the world around us isn't a one-size-fits-all institution anymore. A cookie-cutter liberal arts education without maybe some knowledge in discipline-specific fields in engineering, discipline-specific fields in science, discipline-specific fields in these other branches doesn't make sense. And so there was a congress of college graduates in, I think, the 1870s who actually met in New England to sort of give recommendations to schools as to how they should update a 17th century liberal arts curriculum into a 19th century world. So I don't know if that directly ties back to the burial tradition, but the greater tradition of we're not going to just take it sitting down. They waited a little bit and then came back as a collective. And there's actually a couple of these conferences. I wish I knew more about them. They are described a little bit in that book, Performing Mathematics, if you actually want to pick that one up. I'm sure Cambridge Press would love that too. I think there's like 7 copies sold, and I own 2 of them. Other questions? Well then, thank you once again, everybody, for singing along with us.